The new bill is the so-called Lost Canadians legislation, which passed the House of Commons last week. It means citizenship can be passed down to people born or adopted abroad beyond the first generation.
Given the current state of the United States administration, I think it's important to kind of have that in the back pocket.
More and more Americans are digging through old family documents, tracing forgotten ancestry, and searching for any connection to Canada they can find. And they're doing it for one reason. The United States, under Donald Trump, no longer feels stable. This week, Canada made a decision that has accelerated the shift. Ottawa expanded citizenship rights for people with Canadian lineage, and the first wave rushing toward that opportunity is coming directly from the United States.
Immigration consultants have seen a surge in interest in Canadian citizenship, but caution, it's not a rubber stamp.
It's not sort of a free-for-all type of an application, but I think it's still worth attempting for many people who see that they have either parent, grandparent, great-grandparent who may have been born in Canada.
The turning point came from a simple story. Ordinary Americans with Canadian roots discovering that, for the first time in years, they finally qualify for citizenship through ancestry. Canada's newly updated citizenship framework, designed to correct long-standing legal inconsistencies, now allows more descendants of Canadians to reclaim citizenship that previous rules had denied. Several Americans explained why they acted immediately. They described always feeling a pull toward Canada, but outdated laws had blocked them from formalizing that connection. When Ottawa expanded eligibility, they prepared their paperwork at once. Some said they intend to relocate within the next couple of years, pointing to a growing belief that the United States no longer aligns with their values or expectations for the future. One sentiment appeared repeatedly. With the political environment in the U.S. growing increasingly unpredictable, having Canadian citizenship as a backup suddenly feels essential. Immigration professionals confirm that interest from Americans has surged. Applications are rising, waiting times are lengthening, and ancestry-based inquiries are multiplying. The shift is not driven by curiosity. It is driven by concern, and that concern becomes clearer when we look at the political context shaping this moment.
Canada has always been admired by many south of the border, but this new wave is qualitatively different. People are no longer simply attracted to Canada. They are seeking stability that their own country, in their view, no longer guarantees. Donald Trump's second term has brought a renewed tightening of immigration rules, broad enforcement actions, and sweeping policy reversals. Legal uncertainty has increased for mixed-status families, dual nationals, and even long-term residents. Political polarization within the U.S. has intensified to the point where fundamental rights differ dramatically from one state to another. Many Americans now describe the national climate as erratic and exhausting. Compared to this turbulence, Canada stands out as a calm alternative. Universal health care, more predictable governance, a reputation for civility, and a political culture that avoids constant culture war battles have made the country especially attractive to Americans who feel overwhelmed by their domestic situation. For those with even a distant Canadian ancestor, the option of citizenship is no longer abstract, it feels like a lifeline. This is not an exaggeration. It is the emerging mood among a growing share of middle-class American families, young professionals, and people who no longer see long-term security in the U.S.
Canada's decision to modernize its citizenship laws could not have come at a more strategic moment. For years, the old rules restricting citizenship transmission to the first generation born abroad left many people in legal limbo. Individuals with real, meaningful Canadian roots had no pathway to citizenship simply because their connection fell on the wrong side of a bureaucratic line. The new framework, introduced under Prime Minister Mark Carney's government, extends citizenship eligibility to more descendants of Canadians, provided their Canadian parent or ancestor maintained a substantial connection to Canada. The reform corrects past inconsistencies and reflects the reality of a globally mobile Canadian diaspora. But beyond its technical merits, this reform reinforces Canada's identity. It signals that Canada remains a country that values fairness, inclusion, and stable rule of law institutions, qualities that stand in stark contrast to the volatility many Americans see at home. While the United States tightens, Canada opens. While the U.S. debates who belongs, Canada clarifies how belonging is recognized. That contrast is now reshaping cross-border movement.
What we are seeing now is not an isolated reaction. It is part of a broader pattern that has been quietly gaining momentum. More Americans are applying for permanent residency, ancestry-based citizenship, and even asylum than in previous years. Skilled professionals in healthcare, education, clean energy, and technology are increasingly looking north for long-term security. Many say they no longer trust the direction of U.S. policy, especially in areas touching on rights, healthcare access, and social stability. Canada, without needing to advertise itself, has become a refuge of predictability in a chaotic global environment. Even with domestic challenges, housing pressures, healthcare bottlenecks, Canada is still viewed by many Americans as safer, calmer, and more coherent. The brand of Canada is rising, not because Canada has changed dramatically, but because the United States has. This shift carries symbolic weight. It suggests that North America's gravitational center, at least in terms of social stability and institutional trust, is tilting northward.
For Canada, this moment presents both opportunity and responsibility. The country faces an aging population, persistent labor shortages, and growing demand for skilled workers across multiple sectors. Descendants of Canadians in the United States represent a unique pool of potential newcomers, individuals who are culturally aligned, fluent in English, and able to transition seamlessly into Canadian society. Their arrival is not merely beneficial on an economic level, it enriches Canada's global networks, strengthens the Canadian diaspora, and reinforces Canada's position as a stable hub in an increasingly fractured world. While other nations turn inward, Canada gains strength by remaining open, carefully, strategically, and responsibly. This alignment of domestic needs and geopolitical shifts places Canada in a remarkably strong position. It can welcome talent at the very moment its closest neighbor is driving that talent away.
For the United States, however, the trend is deeply revealing. When citizens of any country begin proactively seeking alternative citizenship as a safeguard, it signals erosion in institutional confidence. That erosion is now visible among Americans with the means, education, and mobility to choose another path. The symbolism is difficult to ignore. A growing number of Americans now see Canada, once considered the quieter partner in North America, as the more stable, reliable place to build a future. If this perception continues, the U.S. could face long-term consequences: loss of skilled labor, international reputational damage, and internal fragmentation as families seek opportunities elsewhere. Canada did not create America's turbulence, but Canada is absorbing its fallout, and doing so with calm assurance.
Canada's expanded citizenship rules mark more than a legislative change. They reflect a profound divergence in the trajectories of two neighboring countries. One nation, Trump's America, is tightening, polarizing, and shaking the confidence of its own people. The other, Canada, is opening, stabilizing, and providing a foundation of trust that more and more Americans now seek. As applications continue to rise and more individuals rediscover long-forgotten Canadian roots, a larger question emerges. If Americans are turning to Canada for stability, security, and sanity, what does that say about the state of the United States today?
Last week, Prime Minister Mark Carney met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in South Korea.
We agreed this meeting marked a turning point,
especially as U.S. President Donald Trump continues to wage his global trade war. China's foreign ministry announcing the government is allowing group tours to Canada again, saying it will further people-to-people exchanges.
After years of diplomatic chill and lost opportunity, a quiet but monumental shift is underway. China has officially reinstated Canada on its list of approved travel destinations for group tours, a move that signals more than just the return of tourists. It marks a thaw in one of the most strained relationships of the past decade, and it comes at a time when global trade politics are once again defined by confrontation from Washington. As President Donald Trump escalates tariffs and trade wars, Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, is charting a different path, one rooted in diplomacy, diversification, and quiet strategic rebuilding. 这周, Beijing's Ministry of Culture and Tourism confirmed that Chinese group travel to Canada can officially resume. It's a decision that carries heavy symbolism. Chinese tourists were once a cornerstone of Canada's tourism economy, making up roughly 60% of many agencies' bookings before relations froze in 2018. That collapse began after the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver on a U.S. extradition request, an event that triggered China's detention of Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, leading to a diplomatic ice age. Even when China began reopening to global tourism in 2023, Canada remained excluded from its approved list, a pointed snub that cost the Canadian tourism sector millions. Now, that exclusion is over. The announcement followed a series of diplomatic gestures. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly's visit to Beijing and, most notably, Prime Minister Mark Carney's 40-minute bilateral meeting with Xi Jinping at the APEC summit in South Korea, where both leaders described their talks as a turning point. For the first time in years, Ottawa and Beijing are speaking the same diplomatic language, reconnection through pragmatism. This reopening isn't just about tourism. It's about trust and about a new kind of geopolitical realism. For Canada, the timing is deliberate. Under the Carney government, Ottawa has been pivoting toward Asia, signing new defense and economic partnerships with South Korea and engaging ASEAN in free trade negotiations. Re-establishing functional ties with China is a logical next step, especially as Trump's America First agenda continues to disrupt global trade stability. China, too, has its motives. With Donald Trump re-elected and waging tariff battles against nearly every major economy, including China, Canada, and the EU, Beijing sees value in easing tensions with secondary Western partners. Reopening tourism to Canada sends a message. China is willing to reward cooperation and dialogue over confrontation. Beyond symbolism, this marks a test of how far Carney's independent foreign policy can stretch before it collides with Washington's expectations. Ottawa knows that the U.S. will watch this development closely, especially as Trump pushes for a tougher North American alignment against China ahead of the 2026 USMCA review. Yet Carney's strategy is rooted in long-term calculation, not provocation. By engaging Beijing through tourism, education, and clean tech cooperation rather than direct trade deals, he's building a soft bridge that strengthens Canada's economic leverage without triggering American retaliation. It's a subtle but high-stakes balancing act, one that defines Canada's new role in the post-Trump global order. Mark Carney's approach is notably cautious, what his advisors call measured engagement. He isn't seeking a full reset or romantic revival of the pre-2018 relationship. Instead, Carney's goal is to stabilize economic channels, reopen people-to-people ties, and avoid overdependence on the United States. Analysts say this is classic Carney, a former central banker applying steady, data-driven logic to diplomacy. His message, delivered quietly but firmly at APEC, was simple. Canada will engage where it benefits Canadians, regardless of Washington's political mood. By framing China as a partner in selective cooperation, not an adversary, but not an ally either, Carney is redefining Canada's global position: independent, pragmatic, and open-eyed. Meanwhile, south of the border, the contrast couldn't be sharper. President Trump's second-term trade crusade has triggered economic whiplash, tariffs up to 100%, supply chains in chaos, and inflation eating into consumer confidence. Trump's hardline stance on China, combined with 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, has pushed Ottawa to seek alternatives. Ironically, the more Washington pressures its allies, the more those allies look elsewhere. The reopening of Chinese tourism to Canada, right after Carney's meeting with Xi, is a symbolic rejection of Trump's isolationism. It suggests that U.S. influence, once absolute in shaping Canada's foreign relations, is no longer the only game in town. In short, Trump's economic wall is pushing neighbors to build new doors. The immediate impact will be felt across Canada's tourism and retail sectors. Before the freeze, Chinese visitors were the world's biggest spenders per capita, staying longer, traveling farther, and spending more than tourists from any other country. Their return could inject hundreds of millions into local economies, from Vancouver to Banff to Toronto. But the broader significance is strategic. Every flight landing from Beijing or Shanghai represents not just economic recovery, but a restoration of trust. Ottawa officials describe this as people-first diplomacy, the idea that cultural and economic connections can thaw what politics froze. This moment fits a larger pattern unfolding across the Asia-Pacific. While Trump strengthens military trade blocs with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, Canada is quietly building bridges in parallel, engaging China, deepening ASEAN ties, and promoting its Trade Diversification 2035 strategy to double non-U.S. exports. In effect, Carney is crafting a new Canadian doctrine, one that accepts the world as it is, fragmented, competitive, multipolar, and seeks to navigate it with economic intelligence instead of ideological loyalty. For Beijing, welcoming Canadian tourists again is a low-cost, high-impact gesture that buys goodwill and signals normalcy. For Ottawa, it's a small but crucial proof that its Asian pivot is working. For years, the Canada-China relationship was frozen in mistrust, collateral damage from great power rivalry. But this week's announcement, modest as it seems, may mark the first real thaw. As Chinese tourists prepare to once again walk through Banff's mountain trails or Niagara's mist, Canada is walking its own path, one that leads away from dependency toward balance. Prime Minister Carney calls it a new era of strategic openness. The world may soon call it something else, the moment Canada quietly came of age as an independent global actor.
We've got breaking news to bring you this hour concerning Canada's auto sector. General Motors is dropping electric van production at its plant near London, Ontario.
Across Canada this week, a quiet shock spread through the industrial heartland. In less than 7 days, two of the country's largest auto employers, General Motors and Stellantis, announced that they were scaling back or pulling production from Ontario. First came Stellantis, moving its Jeep Compass line to Illinois. Then, General Motors confirmed that it would halt production of its BrightDrop electric vans at the Cami assembly plant in Ingersoll, cutting roughly 1,200 jobs. For many, it felt like a heavy blow to a nation that helped build the North American auto industry. These plants were not just workplaces, they were symbols of a country that earned its place through skill, fairness, and persistence. Yet when the layoffs hit, the response from Canada was not rage, it was resilience.
I'll tell you how the Prime Minister how he will deal with the auto sector. He will look at the auto workers in the eyes and he will say, "We will fight for your job."
Canada built cars, steel, and trust, and now it is fighting to protect all three. This isn't just another story about factories closing. It is a test of identity for a country that believes cooperation is stronger than coercion. What's unfolding is not a story of defeat, but a story of a nation rediscovering its strength when the world tests it most. And that fight is being led by Prime Minister Mark Carney and Industry Minister Melanie Joly, who are turning national frustration into action.
Obviously, tough news this morning for the workers in Ingersoll for GM. I had a conversation with the Canadian CEO of GM this morning. I had a conversation with the head of Unifor, who represents the employees, and a conversation with Doug Ford and Vic Fideli, his Minister of Economic Development. So we've decided altogether that we would be creating a new response group because we need to make sure that we fight for these jobs.
When the news broke from GM, the reaction inside Ottawa was immediate. Industry Minister Melanie Joly held early morning calls with the CEO of GM Canada, the president of the Unifor Labour Union, and Ontario leaders Doug Ford and Vic Fideli. By midday, the federal and provincial governments had agreed to create a new response group aimed at bringing a new vehicle model to Ingersoll. It was a coordinated effort to reassure workers that their government wasn't walking away. The same team is also reviewing the Stellantis file after the company's decision to shift 3,000 jobs to the U.S. left Brampton reeling. Joly told reporters that every contract signed with Stellantis includes clear job and investment obligations. Ottawa and Queen's Park, he said, will hold the company accountable for every commitment linked to federal and provincial support. Carney's approach has been calm but firm. His government is refusing to rush into any deal with Washington simply to show progress before next month's APEC summit in South Korea. As Carney explained earlier this week, Canada will not set artificial deadlines or sign a deal that isn't in the best interest of Canadian workers. The government is balancing patience with resolve, making it clear that protecting Canada's long-term industrial strength comes before any short-term political win. Meanwhile, Joly's tone has reflected growing frustration across the country. In public appearances, she has spoken of standing up to corporate pressure and defending the dignity of Canadian labor. Her language resonates with a population that feels it has given enough in tax breaks, in loyalty, in good faith, only to see multinational companies pack up for political reasons south of the border. This is not just a response to one bad week. It's the beginning of a broader shift in how Canada defends its industries and its people.
Behind these corporate decisions lies the ripple effect of Washington's economic nationalism. Since early 2025, the Trump administration has reintroduced sweeping import duties, ranging from 10 to 100% on a range of goods, including vehicles and auto parts from Canada. The White House argues that these measures will bring jobs home. In practice, they have pushed automakers to relocate operations, not for efficiency, but to avoid new tariffs. It's a strategy that may play well politically, but it is backfiring economically. Instead of strengthening North America, it's fragmenting it. Supply chains that once flowed smoothly between Windsor, Detroit, and Brampton are now tangled in red tape and uncertainty. The impact is not confined to Canada. American parts suppliers, shipping firms, and dealerships are also feeling the squeeze. Analysts at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce warned in September that ongoing tariffs are raising consumer costs and disrupting production schedules across the continent. Facing this pressure, Canada has chosen a different path. Rather than retaliate, it is diversifying. Carney's government has intensified outreach across Asia, finalizing a trade deal with Indonesia, engaging with multiple APEC members, and reopening channels with China. Ottawa's message is clear. If Washington turns inward, Canada will not wait idly by. Ironically, Trump's effort to dominate the North American market is pushing his closest ally to look elsewhere. The attempt to make America stronger is instead driving its most trusted partner to build new alliances and new independence. On the streets of Ontario, the news from GM and Stellantis has felt personal. Families who built their lives around factory shifts and weekend hockey now face uncertainty. Yet, amid the anxiety, a new mood is taking shape, one defined less by despair and more by pride. In towns like Ingersoll and Brampton, local groups have launched Buy Canadian campaigns. Community leaders are urging citizens to support domestic suppliers and small manufacturers. Workers who once competed across assembly lines are now united by a single goal: keeping Canada's industry alive.
This collective determination mirrors the government's tone. When Carney and Joly speak of fighting for Canadian jobs, they are tapping into something deeper than politics. They are channeling a form of quiet patriotism that values self-reliance without arrogance. Canada's strength has never come from shouting the loudest. It comes from standing firm when others waver. Trump's rhetoric often fuels confrontation. Canada's answer is persistence. Where Washington pushes with threats, Ottawa counters with endurance and partnership. The message is simple. They can move factories, but they can't move Canada's resolve. The challenge now is to turn that resolve into a blueprint, one that ensures workers in Ontario, Quebec, and across the prairies can see a future in the industries that once defined them.
The fight over GM and Stellantis is not only about 2 plants or 4,000 jobs, it's about the principle that smaller nations have the right to defend their economic sovereignty in a global system that often favors power over fairness. Trump's trade policies may have won him a few symbolic victories in headlines, but they are isolating the United States at a critical time. By weaponizing tariffs, Washington is undermining the trust that made North America an integrated economic force for decades. That trust cannot be rebuilt through threats, only through cooperation. Canada, meanwhile, is quietly proving that resilience can be a strategy. By standing its ground, holding corporations accountable, and pursuing new trade opportunities, it is showing that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it works patiently, methodically, and with purpose. Carney and Joly's defiance is not just political theater. It is a statement of national identity, that Canada will not be reduced to a bargaining chip in someone else's economic war. As the dust settles, one truth stands out. In the age of tariffs and turmoil, Canada's greatest export may not be cars or minerals, but resilience, the quiet confidence to stand tall when others choose to shout.
Prime Minister Mark Carney is continuing his globe-trotting search for trade and investment today. And this morning in Ottawa, the Prime Minister hosted his counterpart from Ireland.
This is one of our strongest relationships, culturally, economically, with respect to shared values in foreign policy.
Across the Atlantic, a striking message is taking shape. Ireland's Prime Minister has called aligning with Canada the obvious choice under U.S. tariffs. On the same day, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney left Ottawa for London to meet leaders of the United Kingdom, Spain, and Denmark. These two developments might look routine, but together they highlight something bigger. Washington's tariff campaign, designed to bring partners closer, is instead nudging them to look elsewhere. Since early September, the Trump administration has enforced its reciprocal tariff regime, removing duty-free treatment for small imports, adding surcharges on heavy trucks, and announcing a 100% tariff on branded pharmaceuticals effective October 1st. The European Union, already under a 15% ceiling on auto and parts exports to the U.S., is recalculating its options. And one of its member states, Ireland, has chosen to say the quiet part out loud.
Ireland's relationship with Canada is not new. Under the provisional application of CETA, their trade has doubled over the past 7 years. The Irish government has now pledged to ratify the agreement formally this year and to send a high-level trade mission across the Atlantic. For Dublin, the motivation is clear. U.S. tariffs hit pharmaceuticals hard, a sector worth tens of billions annually to Ireland's economy. By tightening links with Canada, Irish policymakers are hedging against instability in their largest market. The relationship is not only about exports. Irish leaders have invited Canadian firms to bid on major infrastructure, such as the new metro system planned for Dublin. At the same time, Irish companies see opportunities in Canada's own large-scale infrastructure spending, from public transit to energy. Yes, there are barriers, including interprovincial trade frictions and regulatory complexity, but both governments are acknowledging them and working to streamline. With Ireland set to hold the EU Council presidency in the latter half of 2026, the political signal is powerful. Canada gains a friend with influence inside the European system at precisely the moment when Washington's approach is generating uncertainty. The Irish declaration matters not only in bilateral terms.
When a mid-sized EU economy frames Canada as an obvious hedge, it legitimizes a wider realignment. Carney's meetings in London and continental capitals are part of this pattern. Countries are not waiting for tariff relief from Washington. They are writing new playbooks. Even though the US-EU framework capped most tariffs at 15%, the uncertainties surrounding Trump's policy makes diversification rational. Firms and governments prefer predictability, and right now predictability is easier to find in channels linking Europe and Canada. For the United States, this amounts to an erosion of leverage. The original goal of the tariff strategy was to pull investment and supply chains back to US soil. Instead, Washington is seeing partners deepen ties with each other, often with Canada in the middle. What was meant to concentrate trade is diffusing it. For American consumers and industries, the consequences are already visible. Higher tariffs on home goods, furniture, and trucks risk pushing prices upward. The pharmaceutical surcharge may create pressure if domestic production capacity does not expand quickly enough. Meanwhile, the longer-term effect is that contracts, capital, and joint ventures are landing in Canada and Europe instead of the United States. Ireland's formal ratification of CETA and its upcoming trade mission will be milestones to watch. So will the results of Carney's European tour and any follow-on agreements between Canada and the UK. For U.S. policymakers, the lesson is straightforward. Tariffs can redirect trade flows, but not always toward their intended destination. In this case, the Ireland-Canada pivot shows that pressure designed to reinforce America's centrality is instead encouraging allies to stitch together alternatives. The real scoreboard will not be speeches, but investment decisions, export shares, and supply chain maps in the quarters ahead.